On October 4th, 2019, Ghost Recon Breakpoint was released to the world. This new installment in the Ghost Recon series had a lot going for it, with actor Jon Bernthal being tied to the project as the main antagonist. Not only that, but it was marketed as an upgrade to Wildlands, its predecessor, adding more technological elements and improving upon the stealth elements, with the player being dropped into a new playground as a sole ghost operative. When first released, however, Breakpoint had a very lukewarm reception, something notable in the various reviews and scores given to the game, some giving it a score of 5 to 6, while some straight up gave it a 1 star out of 5. In its base state, Breakpoint was definitely not perfect. While it had its merits, it also had a few flaws that Ghost Recon fans found to be deal-breaking, especially when compared to its predecessor Wildlands, including things like bugs, glitches, and a larger dissatisfaction to its gameplay approach, notably its gear system. Even so, Ubisoft did not stop their support for the game. With the exception of story chapters, major additions like live events and Operation Motherland were added to the game for all players. They also added the immersion update for the game that gave the option for players to remove the gear system, as well as countless quality of life updates. While these updates certainly were received well within the community, it was never quite enough to incentivize the continued support for the game. On April 5th, 2022, shortly after the announcement and subsequent discontinuation of NFTs for Breakpoint, Ubisoft ended its official support for the game, leaving the players with all the content released in the past 2.5 years. By the end of its support of Ubisoft, it's arguable that Breakpoint had turned into the game that it should have been on launch. Undoubtedly, the game would be differently received had these changes been there at the time, but for Ubisoft it's likely that hindsight will have to be 2020 if they want to continue this franchise, especially since the many changes to the game never quite brought in a large player base, even if it did appeal to many stealth and tactical YouTubers. Breakpoint's journey has been an interesting one because, looking back, it was ultimately the updates that were added to the game that made it a better game than it was at launch. In a similar vein to how Cyberpunk 2.0 turned the game around with extra content and quality of life updates, Breakpoint's changes helped to improve many, but not all, of its flaws. So what has changed for the game, and how can it compare now? Let's find out by looking back at Ghost Recon Breakpoint 4 years later. This video aims to look at Breakpoint through a comparative lens. As someone who has been with the game since its early days, the overall gameplay experience of the game has somewhat shifted between the initial release and replaying it now. It has brought about a new sense of appreciation for the world, but also an ability to compare the game to what it was before the updates. To that extent, this video will look at 3 key aspects of the game that have changed over the years, seeking to understand the issues that arose from them and how they have changed for the better. I would also like to focus on the single-player elements as well, meaning this video will not specifically touch on the Ghost War mode as well as the raids, but maybe briefly mention where needed in relation to the game mechanics and bosses. With that understanding, let us have a look at the different elements in Ghost Recon and how they have changed over the years. One of the first things to catch the player's eyes when entering this game is the fact that Breakpoint is set within the fictional archipelago of Aurora. This large landmass, which was bought by tech mogul JCG to run his tech company, is the main playing ground that players will explore for about 90% of the story. Littered with high-tech drones, the strong-handed contractor Sentinel, and ruthless wolves, Aurora is an interesting place filled with the most innovative but also the most dangerous of people. Aurora is a beautiful place, and it's just about as large as the map in Wildlands. This space is split into multiple provinces, with each province usually containing a different biome, including marshlands, jungles, or the snowy peaks. That natural feel is combined with the high-tech ethos of scaled tech, materializing in the form of many different industrial hubs as well as R&D centers, with one long stretching road connecting the entirety of the island together. It also heavily contrasts some of the original settlers on Aurora, that being either the outcasts or the homesteaders, whose lives are less reliant on technology. Simultaneously, the world is really big. A comparison of scale of this is through the world's fast travel system, a network of resting places called bivouacs that also act as a temporary base for the ghosts. While the achievement may make it sound easy to only find 20, there's over 100 of these locations scattered across the map. For that reason, Breakpoint also offers the option to use vehicles instead. The early game already gives access to things like jeeps and helicopters, and makes it a lot easier to travel around, even if that does mean holding the left stick forward for the better part of 5 minutes to reach a certain destination. Because of that, it is often a better idea to simply use bivouacs as a fast travel point, rather than to travel using vehicles, as most bivouacs are better situated near mission objectives or enemy bases. Despite the beauty of Aurora, ease of access to locations, and the variety of vehicles that the Ghosts can use, it suffers from a sense of emptiness and loneliness which, in the context of this game, can be a double-edged sword for immersion within the world. While it is true that the game drops you in an environment where you are supposed to be the lone ghost being hunted, this lonely feeling more so refers to the absence of more life in the archipelago, something that can be explored through two perspectives: the enemies that occupy this world and the rest of Aurora's inhabitants. The main enemy in the game is Sentinel, a private military group, or PMC, that was supposed to be in charge of the archipelago's security. Under the command of Walker, the very same PMCs have now become the de facto ruler of Aurora, with the Wolves being essentially the elite soldiers of the group. They are the antagonistic force of the game, and who you have to eliminate on the quest to defeat Walker. Sentinel's military takeover is coupled with the enactment of martial law, which, during the events of the game, is noticeable through their control of key Aurora facilities, as well as the shutdown of the major highway that surrounds the archipelago. This, combined with the fact that most scale civilians are concentrated in residential areas, means that the only people you'll see on the road are these same Sentinel contractors. When not cooped up and protecting key infrastructure, Sentinel soldiers are typically found either patrolling Aurora or maintaining checkpoints to uphold the aforementioned highway shutdown. Patrols usually take the form of 3 to 4 men on foot, while checkpoints are maintained by about 5 contractors. The only exception to these are those who use vehicles, either doing patrols on the main road or participating in the convoys for Sentinel. There is a lot of pressure on these Sentinel PMCs, largely because they are the only form of human interaction the player would encounter. In the open world, we get the odd conversation either alluding to the unwillingness or growing doubts of Walker's leadership, yet many of these themes remain unexplored except perhaps in Chapter 2, resulting in these contractors falling into the category of action game cannon fodder. Furthermore, it's hard to comment on the ease of eliminating enemies in the game. While these PMCs are very easy to mow down, this is also representative of the game itself being a stealth game, not an RPG. What is a little jarring is the disconnect between these PMCs and the rest of the world. While it is fair to say that PMCs play a largely protective role both in-game and in real life, it often feels like they are just puppets following patrol routes with very little interactions with skilled civilians save for the interrogations outside in the wild. It can add to the overall feeling that these soldiers are almost insignificant in the larger scheme of things, and nothing but a footnote on a long list of fatalities on Nomad's time on Aurora. This feeling is important to point out, as a similar feeling can be felt with the other citizens of Aurora. Characters outside of Sentinel can largely be categorized into 3 factions: homesteaders, outcasts, and scale employees. All 3 factions are victims of the current regime run by Sentinel, though their own presence on Aurora may very much differ from the perspective of the player. Homesteaders are a community that stem from old naval officers stationed on the island. They play a larger role in the story due to the fact that they are the central allies on the island and provide the safe haven of Erewhon for the ghosts. The addition of both Mads as the information guy and Maria as the seller means that the player will always be exposed to these homesteaders. However, this community rarely goes out, largely choosing to deploy strategic operations to ward Sentinel from their base of operations. In comparison, outcasts have a weaker presence in the context of story. Stemming from ex-Scale employees who are against Project Deus, outcasts play the role of guerrilla fighters who have a more active role in the anti-Sentinel and anti-Scale fight. The disagreement on guerrilla tactics, as well as very little interaction outside of missions, means that the player will not get many chances to connect with this faction. The real issue is basically the other NPCs, the Scale scientists and engineers who make up the rest of Aurora's occupants. Many of these civilians are either cooped up in housing complexes or are stationed in places like power plants or in drone development centers. In most cases, these NPCs will only be found when attacking certain locations. In other words, they are not present in all bases. In a way, they pose a civilian risk, being a reason not to randomly spray but to methodically target Sentinel soldiers. However, this risk is never quite realized, as many of these NPCs simply drop down and duck in firefight scenarios, sometimes barely behind cover. There's a very robotic feeling to many of these civilians. While it can seem perfectly normal for someone to freeze in fear in a panic situation, it isn't enough to explain why, after eliminating all soldiers, civilians simply stand up and keep working as if nothing happened. Compare this to NPCs in Ubisoft other games. Civilians in Watch Dogs run away from danger. Villagers in Assassin's Creed attack you with brooms when innocent civilians are harmed. There's a sense that all of these Scale employees are almost copy and paste and not quite there spiritually, almost as if someone just dropped a 3D model in their position. While this does sound like harsh criticism, it is very easy to compare these employees to anyone else on the island. When you compare these employees to both the homesteaders and the outcasts, there isn't much depth to them in terms of dialogue, motivations, or interactions with the rest of the world. Outside of Aurora's side missions, most regular civilian dialogue is either them panicking, responding to Sentinel contractors, or just responding to the fact that you're there. It can somewhat diminish the knowledge that these employees are ultimately being strong-armed into the state of martial law and are really just normal civilians who don't want to be caught in the crossfire. There's also somewhat of an uncanny valley between these NPCs. When it comes to normal interactions, both homesteaders and outcasts respond to the fact that you, Nomad, are someone who's on their side. Yet this doesn't translate over to the average NPC, even if you have completed side missions for them. Oftentimes, these employees will simply tell you off, wondering why you're there and telling you to put the gun away. There's an argument for civilians reacting this way because the player is a domineering soldier, but that doesn't explain why this is the case even for characters that you have helped. There exists a disconnect between how we, the player, see the world versus how the NPCs seem to treat us. Whether this is a reflection of the in-game dynamics is up in the air, but can be frustrating to the player when it comes to the immersion of the game.
Thank you. Oh my God, who are you?
Oh God.
It marks a rather large weakness in the immersion into the world of Aurora, as it somewhat disrupts the illusion of a quote-unquote heroic figure, saving those who have been living life under Sentinel rule. Civilian presence is also really concentrated, largely placed into housing facilities and research and development facilities. While it makes sense due to automation implemented in some facilities like farms, it is also in stark contrast to Sentinel soldiers, who are pretty much present at every single facility, with the exception of relay antennas which are protected by behemoths. This only serves to weaken the image of these civilians further. A significant change to this issue was through the various content additions by Ubisoft. One is the Rebel event, which introduced a stronger outcast presence on the island through new faction missions, as well as the addition of guerrilla fighters in the open world. These fighters will not only take over checkpoints but also make patrols, engaging with Sentinel soldiers and starting faction wars. This event, and later World Parameter, injected a good dosage of civilian interaction that was missing in the released version, but only helped the rebels, with the civilians still suffering from the same exact issues. Ubisoft also added more nuance in the homesteaders, something I had only recently noticed. What used to be throwaway comments about, "Did you ever think it would turn out like this?" becomes more complex conversations that have been added at random within Erewhon, providing players with new insights into individual motivations, as well as a turning cog of plans in place to fight back against Sentinel.
Everything's gone to shit since Sentinel got here.
Sentinel? Don't you mean Skell?
Even if the homesteaders already had a strong impression on the player initially, these conversations further added depth to this faction, providing an emotional basis as well. But when you pull back from the positives that have been added to these two crucial factions, Breakpoint never quite fixed the issue with the regular Skell civilians. For the most part, many of these initial issues highlighted still exist and can still feel quite jarring. While one can never quite argue against the fact that these Skell civilians do interact with Sentinel in some ways, like when they are captured, these interactions are not at the level of the homesteaders or the outcasts, and can be compared in a negative light to many other NPC systems in other games. The changes over time have helped, but not enough for these employees, who feel like they just fade into the background when it comes to their importance on Aurora. At launch, Breakpoint was criticized for the gear system that was implemented within the game. This largely stemmed from the fact that this gear system marked a significant departure from previous titles in the Ghost Recon franchise, especially when compared to its direct predecessor, Wildlands. It also follows a similar trend in recent AAA Ubisoft titles, like Assassin's Creed, with criticism often being levied at the repetitive cycle it incentivizes. While this sounds controversial on paper, Breakpoint's gear system actually differs from other games within the genre. On the surface, it is basically every other looter shooter, expecting players to find incrementally better weapons and gear through regular gameplay, obtaining loot from enemies or from different chests and caches found across the map. Each piece of gear similarly is assigned a rarity, as well as a gear score level. Rarity ranges from common, which is represented by gray, all the way to gold, which represents the highest rarity. Gear score also increases over time depending on the gear score of a player's weapons, maxing out at 250. So where does Breakpoint differ from other similar games? In contrast with your average action RPG, Breakpoint's gear system is less indicative of actual strength and damage, rather it acts as a comparative metric to the enemies on the Auroran archipelago. Normally, enemies have similar gear scores to the player. However, some enemies in the early game, like wolves, will have a substantially higher gear score and are marked in red, indicating more difficult enemies, with an additional skull meaning that it is almost impossible to tackle them head on. These enemies not only hit harder, but much faster, and can detect you much faster and accurately. It's a way for the developers to deter players from directly speeding off into the unknown and tackling any base they find. Instead, it provides an incentive for players to build up their own gear score to take on incrementally difficult enemies and missions. That does not mean, however, that gear score equates damage output within the game, and neither does the rarity of the selected weapon. The level of weapon only directly contributes to the gear score of the ghost, and getting better weapons only means making it easier to tackle harder enemies in terms of stealth, not damage. The rarity of the weapon also achieves something similar, however this is communicated through individual buffs on weapons. These buffs include things like recoil control and drone damage, but never any benefits to damage towards human characters. Higher rarity weapons will have higher denominators for these buffs comparatively to weapons that are not as high in rarity, but this also means that the impact it has on gameplay is largely dependent on how the gun is used, as well as how they approach enemy territory. Even with a few buffs, a player can potentially use any gun to take on a wolf camp, despite the larger gear score difference. As previously mentioned, these systems act as a bit of a barrier to entry into the game's content, similar to many RPGs, in the sense that players are incentivized to go out into the world and get better gear in between missions, to have an easier time dealing with enemies and different bosses. Some missions in the story are marked with the same red or skull markings, while tougher PvE missions like raids require players to have a score of 150 plus to enter, likely to prevent inexperienced players from tackling on harder endgame content. This creates a somewhat unique gameplay loop for Breakpoint, one that requires a balance of looter shooter grind along with the open-ended approach that rewards stealth over aggressive play for those with lower gear scores. While having better gear will always be better, much of the game's actual gameplay makes the approach equally as important to avoid a quick death. At the end of the day, Breakpoint is designed to be a stealth game. Unless you have a completely maxed out gear and perks, and probably just at an easier difficulty, players will be at a disadvantage if they charge blind into enemy bases, and being spotted can quickly become an overwhelming mass of enemies, especially when multiple reinforcements are called in. In the same way, Breakpoint often takes a more beginner-friendly approach when it comes to stealth, providing options for players to deal with enemies in both an easier way and a more traditional way. The developers of Breakpoint have noted that they wanted the game to provide freedom for players to approach bases as they deemed fit. They also mentioned that they wanted stealth to be more accessible to players, both new and familiar with the genre. This is quickly noted through the overall stealth gameplay of Breakpoint, with a wide diversity of infiltration tools and tactical items available to players to use, albeit in limited numbers. Similar to Wildlands, Breakpoint incentivizes players to first do reconnaissance before entering enemy bases. Returning from its predecessor are the Skeltech drones, small units that allow players to observe the base from higher altitudes. It gives players the ability to mark enemies, as well as various base elements like generators and spotlights. This information is further reflected in the minimap and in the general player HUD, making it quite easy for players to identify enemy locations. It gives players a very clear view of the base, especially when marking enemies clear up the red danger areas on one's minimap, becoming a collage of small white triangles for the player to clear up. On easier difficulties, this can make the game very arcadey, in the sense that players can probably get away with a very aggressive takeover with heavy weapons, sticking to cover and tackling enemy threats when they do appear. On higher difficulties, this means that players have the luxury of strategically taking out isolated enemies first before tackling smaller groups of enemies within bases. Things like rocketeers, snipers, as well as automated turrets that can be expertly disabled before engaging in the main firefight. The survival elements within Breakpoint also means that it's equally important to manage weapons, tools, and classes and perks before going into fights. I previously mentioned that many bivouacs are placed near enemy bases, and for good reason. These places allow players to craft tools, but also allow players to switch classes where needed if they would like to change their gameplay approach. From the more stealth-based Echelon class to the more heavy Assault class, each class provides buffs and abilities that aid the intended gameplay method, like more health, better gun control, as well as utilities like the Panther's Grenade that can provide the ability to vanish from enemies instantly. Overall, Ubisoft's approach to Breakpoint's gameplay was one that was supposed to be accessible. While this was certainly clear in their approach to stealth and combat, many were still left unsure about the gear score system, as it essentially kept players from accessing more content unless they had first played enough to reach a certain gear score. Some also questioned why Ubisoft chose to have only one Ghost instead of a full team like in Wildlands, meaning that players could only have teammates if they chose to do online co-op missions, or use sync shot drones to achieve a similar team takedown effect. It was a pretty decent first approach to the gameplay loop, however it is very much arguable that it was the later updates that made gameplay better for all. The first major change for Breakpoint's gameplay was the Immersion update, which was released alongside Chapter 2 of the story in March of 2020. This update straight up removed the gear system, meaning that players would not be impacted by the gear score when it came to missions and enemies, but the raid limit of 150 gear score was still in place. It also introduced major immersive elements. The first was that bullets would be lost on reloading, meaning players couldn't be reload happy with the option on. The second was extra stealth fixes and new tools, notably the bullet casing throw. It provided more options to distract enemies instead of just waiting for them to walk into an isolated position or using a body as bait. The immersive update acted as a way to, for lack of better wording, make stealth more stealth. The customization options in Breakpoint also allowed players to blend their own experience between the base gameplay style and the immersive style, including things like how healing items impacted ghosts, whether or not bullet loss was in play, as well as HUD adjustments. This was well received by the community, allowing people to unburden themselves from the need to build up their gear scores. The further customization also made it incredibly attractive to take a more stealth approach to the game, something noted in the rise of stealth-based combat videos on YouTube. This, combined with the new Echelon class and stealth-based missions in Chapter 2, put the limelight back on the stealth approach to gameplay, rather than the more arcadey and looter style that the players have come to expect from the game. It also provided an ideal environment for players to fully immerse themselves into the shoes of a Spec Ops operative, using stealth and their wits to prevent themselves from being detected by enemies. It added a good deal of tension and strategy to how players approach each enemy base, giving a new dimension to the game. Another major change to gameplay was the release of AI teammates 2 months later in July 2020. I previously mentioned that players were stuck in a single-player environment and required online co-op to actually get a team of 4 ghosts. The addition of these AI teammates meant that players no longer needed to go online for a little bit of support when engaging enemies. Of course, online co-op has its own flavor of fun, but for those looking to have a more casual experience, these AI teammates were perfect, being able to follow Nomad's orders and have the ability to sync shot. Initially, these AI teammates were really just that, a firing squad that supported you. From a functional point of view, they had 3 purposes. Firstly, they provided unlimited sync shots, providing the ability to cool down. This lessened the need to maintain the sync shot drones, with teammates being able to sync shot enemies that were marked by Nomad and activated once in position. The second purpose was, as mentioned, firing support. The team follows Nomad's commands. If the player is in stealth, so will the teammates. Now, teammates themselves will not shoot enemies within stealth, but if the players decide to go the aggressive route, the teammates will respond in kind, providing gun support. This ties into the final purpose, which is to revive the player in the event that they have been downed. In a single player setting, being down usually means death, unless one is playing with the medic ability which can self-revive. Having teammates now means that, in the event that the player is down, they will come and revive you once the coast is clear, or if there are less enemies shooting at them. Ubisoft would later add enhancements to the squad an entire year later in May 2021. This would add skill progression for the entire squad as a whole, which provided new abilities to each teammate. These included abilities like an enemy scan from Fury, as well as a combat drone from Fixit. This change gave each team member a much more unique function, something also reflected in the addition of Rainbow Six Siege team members during the Amber Sky event. In a sense, many of these updates to Breakpoint's gameplay were all positive, and also helped to balance out some of the initial criticism that it had received when it was first released. Many of these updates were ultimately quality of life adjustments that strengthened the overall gameplay experience by improving on elements that many members of the community thought were lacking. It also expanded on the potential customization for many players, which only served to make the game more accessible, but also more immersive for those who wanted that kind of game. It was something that the game sorely needed, and it's visible in the current iteration of the game that these changes would be very hard to live without. Breakpoint had an interesting challenge, to build upon the foundations of the franchise based upon Wildlands while providing a fresh and new experience for both new and returning players of the franchise. While Breakpoint is a sequel to Wildlands, it largely stands alone as its own game, maintaining its link to its predecessor via familiar allies and similar reconnaissance technology. To add on to that challenge, Breakpoint takes place in the fictional location of Aurora, meaning that it is equally important to flesh out the archipelago and to present a grounded immersiveness into the world, one that can hold the player's suspension of disbelief. This is tricky from both a gameplay and story perspective, because Breakpoint deviates from Wildlands by leaning more into its science fiction elements by pitting players against machines of war, and placing them into a setting that is surrounded by enemies that are morally in the grey. It certainly can feel very different, despite the fact that it is still centered around the character of Nomad, albeit with heavy customization options, as he tackles the strange wilds alone to confront his mysterious attackers. Ghost Recon Breakpoint's story is structurally split into 3 chapters, with Chapter 2 and 3 being locked behind a paywall, either in the form of a season pass or as an additional DLC package. Despite the fact that it is called a chapter, each chapter works more as an individual tale or story in the fabric of Breakpoint's continuity, tracking different antagonists and shady projects that occur in the archipelago. While discussing the introspective on the story and mission structure, Chapter 1 will be discussed first, on the presumption that the initial gameplay experience will be encapsulated by the first story release in its initial post-release days. The first chapter of Breakpoint follows Ghost Recon operative Nomad, as he leads a platoon of ghosts to investigate the mysterious sinking of the USS Sea right off the coast of Aurora. Their secondary objective is also to re-establish communications with Skeltech, who have been in a communications blackout and likely the best source of information regarding the attack. This unwittingly puts them in the crosshairs of the archipelago's defensive drones, and also catches the eyes of their elite PMC unit, the Wolves. This results in a platoon of 32 ghosts being largely wiped out in a helicopter crash, with Holt being presumed the sole survivor of the squad from Wildlands. This sets the tone for most of the game. Without the aid of the Bolivian squad, Nomad is forced to follow up on various investigative leads by himself, occasionally enlisting the aid of fellow ghost Sergeant Hill. Accordingly, this means that the story has an investigative structure to it, with Nomad bouncing between key individuals to figure out what links them together, and to ultimately draw up a plan to escape the archipelago. This is reflected in the mission board itself, showing a distinct separation of those who are villains and those who can be considered as allies, all linking towards Operation Greenstone. The investigative tone for the game is also reflected in the initial mission loop. Breakpoint follows a similar system often seen in Ubisoft open world games, wherein players move from one map icon to the next to complete objectives. In the early game, this is largely targeted towards obtaining intel to help start the investigation, but also eventually leads to the destruction of infrastructure and the elimination of key threats. Outside of main mission stories, there is a solid wealth of missions to find and complete as well. Breakpoint has 4 different objectives that players can follow: the main story, Aurora side missions, faction missions, and bonus objectives. Both the Aurora side missions and the faction missions act as additional elements to the story, providing opportunities for players to understand the struggles of Aurora's inhabitants through the eyes of skilled scientists, as well as the quiet survivors of both homesteaders and outcasts. Additionally, bonus objectives give a chance for players to find extra weapon attachments to enhance their gunplay, which adds an extra layer to the gameplay loop for both gear and no-gear players. Breakpoint's story is certainly no masterpiece either, but it does directly tackle its central themes, like the potential technological dangers in war, as well as how idyllic ambitions of soldiers can blind them into committing atrocious acts all in the name of utopia. The game certainly has its fair share of set pieces like car chases, as well as fights against enemies who are well armed with war machines that task players to rethink their own approach to regular bases. This, however, does not fill in the cracks that can appear in characterization, especially when it comes to antagonists. Breakpoint's story does not cover all of its bases, in the sense that there is a clear priority of characterization and storytelling between its characters. Most of the game's story is communicated through cutscenes, often ones where Nomad converses with other characters to establish whether they are friend or foe. Additionally, investigative leads are also found through these cutscenes, which can be key to decrypting various mysteries like whether the ghosts were set up, as well as Walker's own plans for the archipelago. Such cutscenes are often reserved for more central antagonists and central scale characters, resulting in weaker characterization for smaller antagonists. An example are Walker's top lieutenants, Yellowleg, Flycatcher, Silverback, and Rosebud. They play important roles as threats to central scale scientists like Paul and Madeira, and are painted as soldiers and ex-ghosts who share Walker's utopic vision, yet there isn't much to their name in terms of story. While we get a brief bio through individual mission profiles, there is less to gather about them personally through the main missions, despite the fact that they represent the thematic ideal of soldiers who wish to achieve peace through war. This is not to say that they are less menacing when they attack you with drones, but rather these characters feel more like B-grade goons, just enough to know about them to know who they are, but not enough to characterize them like the big bad. We get the occasional scrap through missions and brief character dialogue, but when you do eventually confront and eliminate these ex-ghosts, there is no cutscene, but rather a banner that pops up to let you know that an objective has been completed. While one can say that a lack of cutscenes would impact the characterization of such characters, they can still be memorable from their actions during the main story. What matters more so is the need for further characterization through information and lore, which can be provided outside of cutscenes. In Breakpoint, there are often many details and pieces of information that are left outside of cutscenes, instead to be found through the environment, dialogue from NPCs, or through various collectibles scattered across Aurora. Of these, collectibles are crucial to complete something called investigations. Investigations are a mechanic in Breakpoint wherein the player has to find clues to find answers to certain burning questions about the events in the game, hence the name. These inquiries cover larger topics like identities of key individuals, but also include smaller topics like the origins of various factions on the island. These investigations play the role of a middleman between the player and the story, helping to categorize various collectibles and information, and funneling that into answers that expand on the lore, fill the gaps in the main story, and to answer some burning questions the player might have. These investigations are necessary for players to understand more about the world around them, and pushes players to go out of their way to find various collectibles, which gives them a chance to both explore the world and to visit different installations across the map. This process of finding information to complete investigations can be a little slow, due to the fact that it takes a while for players to fast travel to various locations and to collect these collectibles. Some collectibles tied to main mission locations may remain untouched unless players check their investigations tab and collect them themselves. Other collectibles can often be found in random areas where players may not even explore naturally, meaning that the overall collectible process can often feel quite arduous and long-winding if a player wishes to collect them all. Furthermore, collectibles are not the only way of getting intel and lore. There are two distinct routes where players can get more information to complete their investigations. The first is through quotes and scraps of information gained through the main story, with events and character dialogue listed as evidence and thereby a collectible. The second alternative is through directly talking to NPCs by choosing relevant topics. This is often for characters who are in Erewhon or at the Outcast camp, providing an opportunity for players to directly talk to them and gain a deeper insight in inter-character relationships and learn more about the Aurora environment. While these other methods of obtaining intel does add to the diversity of how one can approach the investigative process, it also takes away from the effectiveness of the storytelling itself. By placing smaller details in collectibles, like conversations between wolves or important documents, players can miss out on key insights on the story, for example the role of government liaison Peter Miles, and especially how deep the rabbit hole of Walker's takeover really goes. Similarly, the scope of investigation doesn't reach deeper into secondary antagonists and more minor characters, meaning that if one gets relevant information that references these characters, there is not a whole lot to back up the characterization of these antagonists. This especially applies to characters and events that happen during side missions, which don't really get a mention within these investigations, weakening the overall effectiveness of both the story and the investigations mechanic. The end result is a persisting gap between the characterization of characters in the main story and the characterization of characters within these collectibles, even if that gap is small. While the characters in the main story can feel like they are lacking characterization, Breakpoint does try to make this up using investigations. Whether it is effective or not may be up to individual interpretation and the lengths they will go to actually read the collectibles. And while the game does have its moments and great set pieces, there are definitely characters in Chapter 1 who are left in the dark when it comes to storytelling, with explanations for character motives being left to various collectibles if any at all, and any further details are only left to the player's imagination. As part of their post-launch roadmap, the developers for Breakpoint would add more story elements to the game in the form of both chapters as well as various limited time events that would further expand on the archipelago's conflict and provide space for crossovers with operators from Ubisoft's other IPs. On March 24, 2020, the first additional chapter was released, named Deep State. This update will be closely followed by the addition of both the Ghost experience as previously mentioned, but also the first limited time crossover event. Chapter 2 Deep State itself is a crossover event, it being a crossover with Splinter Cell, specifically bringing in both Sam Fisher and Victor Coste into the fray on Aurora. Chapter 2 closely follows the structure that was first seen in Chapter 1, which is the investigative tone taken in missions, with Nomad working with Sam Fisher to uncover the mysterious Project Claw, and to enable a breach in the island's defenses to successfully extract the strategist, a shadowy figure who has been pushing for Project Claw to continue development on the archipelago. Comparatively to the first chapter, Deep State is much shorter. The investigative process still pushes Nomad to follow up on Sam's leads and to track down key individuals to determine their role in Project Claw, whether they are enemies or simply scientists who have been coerced into a menacing project. Since there is less of a mystery surrounding the island by the events of Deep State, the story is more direct, being more focused on the sabotage of the strategist's plans. This is reflected in the number of available missions, as well as the significantly smaller objectives board that highlights only 6 key persons of interest in comparison with Chapter 1's selection of both persons of interest and high-value targets that are to be eliminated. Due to the crossover with Splinter Cell, this chapter also opts for more stealth design in its mission. While the original chapter similarly pushes players to be stealthy in missions, there is a larger highlight to this element in this chapter. With the new Echelon class, the class ability is charged from stealth kills, with the Echelon pistol similarly more effective from stealth, due to the class ability being able to snap to a headshot if seen by enemies. In some missions, stealth also becomes a requirement, like the beginning of the final mission. Additionally, laser security safeguards are also frequently seen during the events of this chapter, meaning players cannot directly run around without considering the risk that they'll trip a laser. These combinations make the mission structure of Chapter 2 more stealth inclined, and combined with the event-specific items, can place players in the shoes of an Echelon operative themselves. Importantly as well, Chapter 2 helped to further 2 points of the story that remained as loose ends within the first chapter. The first loose end was Midas, who was presumed dead in the initial helicopter crash. This was proven to be false, and Midas was kidnapped for experimentation under Project Claw, making him one of the 4 remaining ghosts on the island, along with Nomad, Halt, and Hill. The second loose end it addresses is the project funding of Sentinel, expanding on the questions about the ghost being set up on Operation Greenstone. A further glimpse into the role of some corrupt government figures defines why the second chapter is named as such, demonstrating to the player that Walker's plans were never only confined to the archipelago. The story of Breakpoint will once again expand just under 6 months later. On September 15, 2020, the third and final chapter was released under the name Red Patriot. This third chapter is not a crossover, but rather it establishes links to other Ghost Recon games, with the inclusion of both Scott Mitchell and the Bodarks, now under the wing of Trey Stone and Raven's Rock. Furthermore, the investigative process that was commonly seen in Chapter 1 and 2 is now gone, replaced by a much more urgent deck of 10 high-value targets, all set up for elimination to prevent Trey's Kingmaker operation from getting off the ground. Comparatively to the previous 2 chapters, there is even less mystery for the ghosts. Operation Greenstone had the ghosts in a strange new land and required them to really investigate and find leads, while Deep State pushed ghosts to uncover the conspiracy and break it down one pillar at a time. This priority has shifted to a direct target, with intel being fed to the ghosts about the top leadership in Stone's operation. This approach is more straightforward, with Nomad tackling a mixture of wolves, Bodarks, and Raven Rock operatives, mixing in both new and old enemy factions together in one fell swoop, as one final way to wrap up story threads. As a result of this approach, the storytelling approach is different on the Red Patriot. Instead of cutscenes between various allies, most information is obtained through briefings with Colonel Scott Mitchell at key bivouacs, providing mission briefs and a quick background of targets and their role in Operation Kingmaker. This established the function of these characters more concretely across the 3 sectors of Stone's operation: R&D, strategy, and power. It gives players a better understanding of these various characters without the need for cutscenes, as there really isn't much to make into a cutscene considering that most missions are elimination based. These elimination missions are reminiscent of elimination missions in the original Operation Greenstone, specifically towards Flycatcher, Rosebud, and Silverback. It involves players investigating the whereabouts of these HVTs and to eliminate them based on the information they have found. These missions can include sabotaging operations to draw them out of hiding, or it could also mean sabotaging operations after the target has been eliminated. There's also some unique missions, like identifying the new leader of the wolves via intel obtained, and to get to them before an alarm is raised. This certainly presented a fresh and new mix of elimination missions and strategies, with players having to do more recon in several missions for a smoother execution of the mission. Both Deep State and Red Patriot helped to further expand the story, with each passing update for the respective episodes simultaneously adding to the overall quality of life in Breakpoint. The additions to the story also helped finish up the story that was started in the first chapter, with Trey Stone finally dealt with in Red Patriot and ultimately the end of Walker's Wonderland conspiracy. Both stories are also shorter, possibly reflective of its status as DLC content, but also means the story felt stronger, with Nomad pursuing one singular goal rather than the need to tackle various faction missions and side missions, meaning these chapters had a purpose to primarily expand on the main story. These benefits are, however, marred by the fact that they are locked behind a paywall, meaning that, with the exception of the first mission of Deep State, many players who played the base game couldn't experience these additional aspects of the story. One of Ubisoft's final expansions for Breakpoint was the addition of Operation Motherland in 2021, which was also known as the Conquest mode. This expansion was free for all, acting as a sort of finale for Aurora's story, taking place 3 months after the end of the events of Red Patriot, where the Wonderland conspiracy finally ended and Nomad and co were extracted back to the States. Following on from the events of Red Patriot, Operation Motherland is similarly tied to old foes, with Bodarks acting as the main antagonistic force and Karen Bowman also returning to the fold from Wildlands as a point of contact for the operation. Operation Motherland was a distinct step in a different direction for the playstyle of Breakpoint, something apparent in the fact that the players had to choose this expansion as a separate mode, rather than as additional missions that could be selected like chapters 2 and 3. This is because there are key differences in the gameplay loop for the player, with Nomad losing access to both Air 1 and the Resistance base, instead relying on bivouacs for preparations. Additionally, each individual region in Aurora is also gridlocked by its own series of unique challenges and limitations for the player, like hostile airspace and more machines of war patrolling the roads. In Conquest mode, Nomad is tasked to slowly carve their way through Bodark operations by systematically breaking down Bodark hold on each region, building their way up to identify and eliminate key leaders within the operations on Aurora, and all in the name of helping the outcasts gain sovereignty on the archipelago. Instead of investigating leads like in prior episodes, Operation Motherland prioritizes taking control of strategic locations in each region to guarantee that outcast operations can succeed. However, these locations are heavily guarded, and various factors impact just how difficult it can be to take back these regions. Therefore, players pursue a set of destabilization missions in each region, like destabilizing drone activity or strengthening outcast numbers, so that the final assault on these locations can have a higher percentage of success. Unlike both Chapter 1 and 2, the approach for the story in Operation Motherland is less cutscene oriented, making it more similar to that of Chapter 3. Most of the storytelling is communicated through dialogue, largely through mission briefings from Bowman, but also through NPC dialogue that helps Nomad have a better picture of what is unfolding on the archipelago. Despite the fact that this expansion does not have cutscenes, the dialogue does help to carry the story, and, comparatively to the base game, is more direct and less reliant on further dialogue to help establish particular characters and their function in the operations. As Bowman is the one who provides intel and helps to make connections, players can focus more on the action rather than the investigative aspect of the game. Very interestingly, the game also provides more options to players during main missions. While most of the original trilogy of episodes was focused on eliminating targets, Operation Motherland provided options for players to neutralize or capture key leaders within the Bodark movement, marking a higher degree of freedom and giving players an opportunity to have brief interaction with these villains, rather than simply leaving the scene of the crime after shooting them dead. It is certainly different from the base game, where oftentimes there is no interaction in these environments except for a few exchanges, and is also a satisfying alternative for the end of these missions. This makes Operation Motherland one of the most unique aspects of these last 4 years, being a mode that takes on the gameplay in a vastly different direction, and making it more streamlined. For starters, there is more intense faction warfare between both Outcasts and Bodarks, and the changes in mission destabilization missions are instantly noticeable, making the impact of each mission felt instead of assumed. The approach of the story in this mode is also upfront and communicated through dialogue, not cutscenes. While the game itself similarly has collectibles found in a specific mode, it never really feels like one needs these collectibles to fill in the cracks in this mode, with Bowman's intel and Ito's breakdowns helping to fill out the space of the story. The final facet to this discussion of the story is the crossover missions. This comes for one major reason, and that is crossover missions were originally intended to be limited time events for players on their first release, providing exclusive rewards to players in the form of unique weapons and new utility tools. I had previously mentioned that the first crossover event was after the release of Episode 2, but this is not strictly true. In total, Ubisoft had 3 crossover events for Breakpoint over this period, which were respectively the Terminator event, the Resistance event, and the Amber Sky event. Unfortunately, Ubisoft lost the rights to the Terminator license and had to scrap the event from the game, meaning it is impossible to access these missions, and it is similarly impossible to visit these mission locations unless you try glitching through them. Despite the fact that they were limited time, both the Resistance event and the Amber Sky event have long since been reinstated as permanent missions accessible from the objectives page, just without the original rewards. Events are interesting in terms of story because, from the Resistance event onwards, the method of story delivery changed. Previously, the approach of cutscenes versus collectibles was discussed for the base game, with players having to contact various NPCs face-to-face to pick up missions and debrief missions. This approach is not apparent in Red Patriot or Operation Motherland, which switched their method of delivery to dialogue through communications. The Resistance event started this trend, which introduced the use of the radio, a contact point within Air 1 that will be the starting point of both event missions and also the missions in Chapter 3. Instead of initial cutscenes to start off the direction for Nomad, players are instead treated to an opening sequence to act as a briefing, establishing threats, stakes, and Nomad's role. This approach is vastly different from just NPCs, creating an atmosphere that is more akin to a pre-mission briefing a soldier would get, and is also stylistically similar to certain briefing missions in Wildlands. This, once more, reflects a change in tone for Breakpoint as the player progresses, moving from an investigative tone to one that is backed by more intel from people on the island. Instead of navigating in the dark and requiring the aid of several sources, this radio and the way it communicates to Nomad represents that there is now a light in that same dark, with intel being fed to a spec-up soldier who is ready to take the villains down. These events also act as a way to spice up the Auroran battlefield, providing new threats and new mechanics in the form of world parameters. As previously mentioned, the Resistance event provided the world parameter of outcast presence on the island, battling Sentinel patrols and also disabling Azrael drone patrols on the archipelago. The Amber Sky event, being a crossover event with Rainbow Six, enveloped areas of Aurora with a deadly amber ruin gas, which pushed players to use filters to survive within the bioweapon, meaning players could not sit idly by in bases and had to grab filters before they choked to death on the orange fumes. The addition of these events may seem trivial, as somewhat of a novelty, and while that could be said for the Terminator event, which shares its weird dose of sci-fi with the Predator event at Wildlands, the same cannot be said for both the Resistance and the Amber Sky events. In fact, these two events are an in-between for each individual chapter, playing a role of diversity to the player's game experience and expanding on the storytelling of Breakpoint through the changing landscape of Aurora, with the map slowly changing from one that was taken over by Sentinel to one that the Ghosts ultimately free for the outcasts. These events aren't disconnected either, with Haruhi Ito already being a figure from the base chapter leading the charge with the outcasts in the Resistance event, and the Amber Ruin gas in the Amber Sky event being remnants of bioweapons that were originally meant to be used by the Bodarks in Chapter 3. Pulling back from the individual events and story chapters, it paints an overall larger story progression for Breakpoint. The original chapter of the game saw Nomad being thrown directly behind enemy lines on an unforgiving archipelago, having to investigate who the real enemies are and to build up a network of allies to bring them down. As time goes on, we see that this expands outside of the initial Wolves and Walker circle. With Nomad having more intel on this archipelago, he is able to execute more operations and more efficiently deal with enemies like Trey Stone and the Strategist, all the while bringing home allies and loosening hostile influence on the civilians on the island. All the while, the archipelago itself is changing, with the outcasts now playing a louder role in the insurrection, and the desperation of remaining enemy factions manifesting itself into terrorist ploys and black market deals. In the end, Breakpoint's story does help to reflect that eventual shift from an occupied state to one that is free from the clutches of any militia, whether they are Bodark or Sentinel. It definitely marks a contrast with the story now, rather than the state it was in Chapter 1. It paints a more transformative picture, rather than leaving players on a cliffhanger after Walker, and fully plays out these changes to the landscape. As time goes on, there is also less to be found in the investigations mechanic, something that was phased out more post Chapter 2, showing a stronger investment into characterization in later chapters, but also reflecting that same change of tone from investigative to intel-fed. And while the story can certainly be more well received now, it still sucks that those who did not buy the DLC cannot gain access to episodes 2 and 3, and can only experience the story of Operation Greenstone, its 2 events, and Operation Motherland, which can be a disjointed experience without the paid content. Breakpoint is not a perfect game, but the developers have continued to actively contribute to perfecting it, with the community not far behind in providing both its criticism and support for the game. At launch, Breakpoint could be seen as a somewhat flawed entry into the franchise, yet the state it is in now far exceeds the state it was in 2019, with various quality of life changes being made, like improving the gameplay and enhancing the world of Aurora. Further content expansions have also served to make the story more complete and provide a holistic experience rather than just the first chapter. There's still some things left to be desired, like the civilian NPC behaviors and content paywalls, but one cannot deny that the overall shift for the game has been a positive one. At the same time, it reflects that it would have been better to have these changes already here on day 1, rather than being something implemented months later after the initial release, at a time where players may have already had their fill of the game or even dropped the title. Would the ratings for the game have been different had these changes been implemented? That is hard to say, but it is likely that there would have been more favorable discussions had they been here. I still like this game, because, for all intents and purposes, it is a fun experience being a Spec Op operative wreaking havoc through Sentinel operations on the archipelago, and using intel to make a good stealth approach. This game was never meant to be a story-centric experience like Detroit Become Human, nor was it meant to be as cinematic as Death Stranding. It's an experience that wants players to have that open-world fun on an island full of threats, but that's why elements like world building and gameplay can be that much more important in the discussion of games like these. To that end, Ubisoft has positively contributed to making that gameplay experience that much more interesting and fun. something that can hopefully translate into future titles and mean even better content in the future. Thanks for watching this video. It's been a solid year since I posted a video due to mixed procrastination and also writer's block in how to approach writing about Breakpoint. I got this title a month shortly after it was released, and despite the fact that I don't have gameplay clips from its initial release, I've heavily felt the change that the gameplay has had in these few years, making it something that I wanted to reflect on. While I did not cover everything about this game, I did try to cover the 3 main points that stuck out to me when I was playing these games over these last few years. Despite the fact that Ubisoft has done all this good for this game and actually implemented a lot of these changes that's made the game better, it never really managed to recoup the rocky start that it had on its release in 2019. And despite the increase in various YouTube videos about tactical operations and tactical videos with this game, it has never really come back from its rocky launch. But that's all for now. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.